Greetings and welcome to Edgy Ideas, the podcast that explores what it means to live the good life and create the good society in our disruptive age. My name is Simon Western, and I will be talking to invited guests about diverse topics, exploring social conscious and unconscious dynamics and desires. Welcome to this edition of Edgy Ideas podcast. Today my special guest is Paul Skinner. Paul is an award-winning author and consultant whose focus is on collaboration and purpose. Paul advises diverse organisations such as PwC, the United Nations, Sony and Save the Children. Paul is also founder of Marketing Kind, which is a community formed to enable collaborative volunteering to tackle social challenges. Paul's author of Collaborative Advantage, and his most recent book is The Purpose Upgrade. Paul, you're very welcome to Edgy Ideas. How are you today?
I believe I'm well. A few cobwebs from travel, but I've been looking forward to this. And on the one hand, I don't really know what to expect, but on the other hand, I feel like embracing it almost like a sort of professional psychotherapy session, but with the small jeopardy that there may be people listening into the inner workings of whatever gets revealed. So I'm very much looking forward to this present moment.
Good, me too. We don't know each other well. We met at Save the Children a few weeks ago, and we shared books. And I've looked at your Purpose Upgrade book, and I think our thinking and our work is probably aligned, but we'll find out during the conversation, I guess. Do you want to just say a bit about your background, how you kind of the journey you've been on to get to where you are today?
Sure. So, I mean, by profession, my background is in marketing, but I suppose I've gone well beyond what you would usually think of as, work that has marketing in the job description. But I still believe hugely in the power of narrative, fundamentally, to shape who we are and the world around us. You can think of, I made the comment in the introduction about looking forward to it like as if it was a professional psychotherapy session. Well, in a sense, you can see marketing as a department in a business alongside finance or HR. You can also see marketing as a narrative-based discipline that would therefore sit alongside other narrative-based disciplines, such as history or psychology, for example. So I'm very interested in how narratives shape the world around us, and I have three sort of professional hats really for doing that. Firstly, I do advisory work where I support leadership teams in mobilizing around stories of meaning and purpose among their external stakeholders as well as their internal stakeholders. I also run a non-profit community where we believe that the world's most pressing problems depend even more fundamentally than on technology or finance to be solved, on forms of human cooperation. And so therefore we can choose to read them as intriguing marketing briefs in disguise. And then, of course, I write my books with the hope of making my ideas useful to a broader audience than the groups that I get to work with through my advisory work and my non-profit. And my first book proposed a radical alternative to the conventional goal of competitive advantage in the form of collaborative advantage. And my more recent book, as you kindly mentioned, is about how we can achieve an upgrade to the very purpose we're pursuing in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Marketing often has a kind of a bad name in the sense people think that you're selling something, your sales kind of a team. But as you say, it's a much richer frame of thinking when you bring the narratives into it and storytelling and narratives. And it's kind of part of what organizations do, whether they're charities or whether they're businesses, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you leave narrative until you've already got something to sell, then you're in the sort of, as my dad said, when you ask the Irishman the way to the post office and he says, I wouldn't start from here. So in a sense, you kind of, you've left it until too late in the process.
Yeah.
and I think also in terms of narrative, people often think about the value of storytelling in business and in organizational life. But it's also worth considering that narrative competence lies as much in the questions that you ask as the answers that you give. It lies in how you listen, it lies in how thoughtful you are in processing what you listen to. It lies in terms of how you're able to align the different stories that you hear from your different stakeholders. It resides in, the vision of change and how your understanding can help to sort of melt people into a better future for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, looking at your purpose upgrade book, I noticed when I think of narratives, I think that a narrative can hold many stories, and your purpose upgrade book really emphasizes that. From what I read in this, in that you don't think about the purpose being like a fixed plan. It's very kind of emergent, and it can hold a plural kind of stories, and it's going to be changing. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's even in our biology, you've got genetics, who you are, and you've got the epigenetics of what gets revealed in you by circumstance. I think that even when we think about quite enlightened notions of purpose, the typical analogy is to think of it as your North Star, for example.
Mhm.
And we might talk about some of the merits of that, in that a North Star is something that can help you to navigate. And there is a lot that we could explore in terms of purpose helping us to orientate ourselves and to navigate. But of course, a North Star is an inanimate object. It's fixed eternally. Whereas in the human world, the nature of our problems is changing around us all of the time. And, we have in common that we've done a lot of work respectively with the humanitarian sector. And so something that we'll be familiar with is that often, far from just falling apart, when struck by a crisis, communities can be at their very most purposeful.
Yeah, yeah,
If I think in my own life, one of my most purposeful experiences is when my mum and dad came to visit for a relaxing weekend, but my father had a stroke. And being a heart transplant patient, we had to get him not just to any hospital, but to a particular specialist hospital. And, I remember driving him 200 miles to get to that specialist hospital or trying to keep him awake. And I think the ingredients that made that purposeful was, first of all, a real problem to solve. Secondly, an outcome that could be reached, getting him to
yeah.
specialist care, but also the fact that there was something I could do to make that
Hmm.
difference. If I'd been in the passenger seat, it would have been the same situation, but that wouldn't have occurred to me as a moment of purposefulness in quite the same way. I think back to President Zelensky in one of his speeches earlier in the invasion, when he said, Ukraine didn't seek greatness, but Ukraine has become great.
Hmm.
And I think it's true that, the sense of Ukrainian nationhood that we all perceive and understand is far greater today
Yeah.
than it was a couple of years ago. So in a sense, a lot of our most purposeful endeavor probably comes not when things are going according to a linear plan, but when something has completely knocked us off, and we have to fundamentally reprioritize altogether. And so I'm very interested in how working on purpose can elevate the very nature of the problems we're trying to solve in the first place. Not just a narrative of how do we better tell our story, but a process of what is the better story to tell and to live up to,
Yes.
which is a rather deeper process.
And in your diverse consultancy work, like I go to private sectors. I work in banks. I work in the not for profits. We meet many people. What's your experience of where people are in regards to their purpose at the moment? What kind of stories are you hearing?
So I suppose fundamentally, we're not in an easy moment.
No.
I remember when he was prime minister, and this is not to say anything for or against him, but I remember listening to Tony Blair saying that the essential characteristic of the modern world was its interconnectedness. And I think that interconnectedness of opportunity was palpable then. My sense is that the pendulum is sort of swinging back the other way from interconnectedness to interdependence, and that the essential nature of our contemporary environment is that we have multiple serious crises feeding into each other, exacerbating each other. And that means that when we're pursuing one purpose, we have to become often unexpectedly and in difficult and challenging ways aware of and able to integrate and adapt around many other problems that require us to think far more ambitiously about the nature of our purpose and what we're intending to achieve, lest activity to solve one problem simply serves to further exacerbate other
Yeah.
problems. And
Yeah.
so I think there is if people cling to outdated models of thinking, there is a risk of overwhelm.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if people are able to jettison some of their own prior expectations and embrace the challenges of the present moment, there is huge potential for meaningful, purposeful endeavor, and that getting rid of what's old and doesn't work and embracing a new challenge can give as much energy as it demands.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's my experience, that there's a one section which are feeling stuck and disillusioned and overwhelmed. All they hear is bad news, and the world's collapsing, and they get kind of stuck in that, and then they focus on a very yeah, they reduce the world around them to something which is manageable. That kind of doesn't give them the energy. It gives them kind of some relief, but doesn't give the energy to kind of really go further. Go to that interesting place, which is actually facing the unknown as well. I mean, the interesting about purpose and the unknown. What's your thoughts on that? On there's so much emergence out there. There's so much kind of unknown. When we travel on a path, how does purpose relate to that?
So I think this is where we shoot ourselves in the foot if we think of purpose as a fixed endpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we need to recognize that in the human world, and so much so in today's environment, there isn't a single fixed endpoint. There isn't a point at which all of our multiple problems is solved if only we take the actions A, B, C. And
Yeah.
in fact, I'd say many of today's problems are a bit like trying to solve a simultaneous equation, in that the important part of the challenge is to know how many variables you're solving for. And when I listen to people and their visions for the future, the most common problem is not that there is something illogical on the inside of that vision. The problem is that so many visions for the future have a shadow, something they leave out, which then becomes the problem. So, for example, I am a fervent supporter of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I can't remember reading much in the Sustainable Development Goals about media reform. And if we want to cultivate a global culture that is adequate to adapting to the nature of today's problems, then we need to share media narratives, societal narratives. The stories that we tell each other across society need to be demanding the right kinds of change. And that is difficult if you have a media environment that falls very far short of the mark in terms of adequately representing the nature of the world's challenges, and thereby stopping us demanding the kind of changes and reform and redirection from our leaders that might be adequate to meeting those challenges.
Yeah, yeah, and that's very interesting. And in my work, I am constantly finding people. They employ me because they want to understand different ways of leading, that share some ideas around leading in ecosystems, these multifaceted ways of working. I talk about the ecosystems of technology, of society and people, and of the environment coming together. That these things can't be separated. You can't separate these things anymore. We're we're dealing with kind of multiple issues all at once. What I get confronted with quite often is the pressures of short termism. People have they have targets they have to reach, they have stakeholders they have to please, and then there's these longer term challenges. How do you address that in your work?
So I think that's certainly right. I mean, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, said, "In the long run, we're all dead." I think that perhaps what we need to sort of upgrade our thinking currently to recognise that in the long run, we're all on the same side.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that instead of to expand our thinking, I had a conversation on this topic, as it happens, with the Harvard economist Rebecca Henderson, who wrote the marvelous book Reimagining Capitalism, and she told me we needed to move from thinking about the I now to thinking we later. From me now to we later, I think was her
Mm-hmm.
phrase. And so I think that's right. And I think this is where, the nature of our problems is changing. And so we maybe need to flex and morph the boundaries of our thinking to go with it. I think it is the case, if we think of democracy, for example, some of our problems do not easily align with the spatial and temporal coordinates of democracy. The problems are longer term than 4 or 5 year election cycles, and they are
Yeah,
wider in their reach and implications than a particular nation state, for example. And so I think that we need to get much better at thinking outside of boundaries. And I think, in some ways, this does relate to my books, in that, for example, the notion of competitive advantage very much grew out of thinking within the boundaries of a business. The assumption is you create a competitive advantage by lining up the resources you own, manage, and control, and you use them to create a superior value that you then deliver to your stakeholders as if they are the passive recipients of that value, and no doubt
yeah,
pathetically grateful for it. I'll give one example of where I think that misconstrues the value creation process. It's a very simple one. If you and I, if we were having this conversation, or if we continued this conversation in a Starbucks or a Costa, wherever it might be, and an economist joined us, and we asked, well, who here is creating the most value? The economist might say the barista, the franchisee, the landlord, the brand. Probably wouldn't say the customers. But
yeah.
certainly from my perspective, the reason I would be there would be to enjoy the conversation with you.
Mm-hmm.
And the warm brown liquid that accompanies that conversation would play a relatively ancillary role. And you'd probably find me rather strange if we, went about this and I said, do you know what? I'm not really a fan of Starbucks, so I'm going to drink at Ron's Coffee over the road. And then you can tell me how you got on at Starbucks. So in reality, our customers, in the case of a for-profit business or other stakeholders for other organizations, are always creating more value than we deliver to them. Otherwise, there isn't a business opportunity in the first place. So
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that we think within boundaries because we can reduce, as you say, you use the word reduce. We reduce our context to something we think we can control. But in
yeah,
so doing, we can often misconstrue how value is actually being created, how positive change can actually best be achieved. And so, in a sense, we come to prioritize efficiency, which intrinsically is a good thing, but we may come to prioritize it in a way that overshadows, obscures, and reduces our effectiveness, which is ultimately more important than efficiency.
yeah. No, I wholly agree. I mean, I wrote a report for the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. They invited me to kind of do some research, and I came up with this notion of eco mutualism, this thinking
Mm.
that we have to think in ecosystems. But I'm thinking more and more about the mutualist part, and how you have to really, in any enterprise, in any piece of work, any organization, think about creating shared value and what that means. So in the humanitarian world, there's been this sort of notion, really a deep held notion of sort of salvation aid. You know, we the rich give to the poor, we the powerful give to the marginalized, and it's a supply and demand. It's a kind of one way, kind of binary way of thinking. If you put mutualism and collaboration at the heart of that, then you're asking how can create mutual value. You know, what value are we getting out of this, as well as kind of the other. How can they co-create value for themselves, and what is that value? So that question of value, I think, is fundamental in many ways.
Yeah, and maybe I could jump in on that because that resonates with me, and a way that I often think about it is in terms of thinking about human agency.
Mm.
So, in the example I gave of Starbucks, the competitive advantage model views us as consumers.
Yeah,
As if our sole role in life is to diminish by however many units the world's reserves of whatever it is that they're trying to sell us. Or in the case of aid, somebody who receives aid is a beneficiary of the
hmm,
aid and should be grateful for the fact that they're being given shelter, food. In many
yeah,
cases, they will be, so it's not to underestimate that, but it is a very pacifying view of stakeholders.
mhm,
In the business world, I think that this undermines the value creation process because it overlooks that all of our stakeholders are creating value. Shareholders are not just walking checkbooks, they're people who can invest in our future and help us to live up to it. Humans are not just resources,
yeah,
they're colleagues bringing their discretionary efforts to bear. Probably the big one is communities. Communities are not just markets. The markets is an abstract economic reduction. I don't know if you've ever seen the soft drinks market. If you ever have, you can show me where it is. But in reality, markets per se don't actually exist. But you do have
mhm,
communities. And I'll give one example of how overlooking this, loses value, and looking at it in this way gains value. So if you think of Unilever in India, for a long time, Unilever India overlooked rural Indian villages
yeah,
because they couldn't reach them with advertising and they couldn't afford their products. And so, from a conventional consumer perspective, that's an awful market.
yeah,
Um, Unilever decided to view those communities, however, not as markets, but as communities with shared problems, communities looking to build shared resilience, co-creation, as you say, helping each other through life and through their problems. And so at that point, they launched something called Project Shakti, where they employed female entrepreneurs in rural villages to take adapted versions of Unilever products, often in sizes and with adaptations that made them accessible in terms of price points, and actually took them round dwelling to dwelling, sort of Avon style. And that, first of all, has created huge community value because it's enabled Unilever products to play an important part in helping to fight the spread of infectious disease and so on and so forth. It's improved sanitation,
mhm,
but it's also unlocked 5% of Unilever's revenues in India, which 5% of a Unilever is a big deal.
yeah,
But in the aid world, of course, a lot of aid depends on the notion that the recipient of aid is a passive recipient of support. Whereas
yeah,
in reality, if you're caught in a crisis, you are going to do everything you can to get yourself out, to get the people around you out. And, viewing aid as something to be delivered to people as passive recipients is why we ended up, for example, in the case of Syria, the majority of people who fled Syria bypassed the humanitarian system altogether because they were looking for things they could do to help themselves in other countries with family contacts and finding a way to struggle through to recreate a life for themselves after forced displacement. And if we look at the kinds of humanitarian organisation that we've worked with, you can find different roles for them to play. If your starting point is how do we best unlock human agency
Yeah.
from the person affected all the way through to all the different layers of support that we provide for them. And so the collaborative advantage notion has appealed, on the one hand, to donors who want to maximize the value and impact of anything that they inject, and therefore would want to line up all stakeholders around creating coherent value. But he's also appealing from the perspective of human rights and actually caring about the outcomes that people in the most difficult situations are able to achieve for themselves. And it's why, for example, I think we need a completely different debate around global asylum, because a refugee, one of the most memorable things I've heard is a refugee saying, I don't want charity, I want you to invest in me.
Yeah.
We've all seen examples of refugees working in a very entrepreneurial way when they're, when not just when they're allowed, not just when they're helped to, but when we stop preventing them from
Yeah.
being able to do that, as if we're sort of holding a football underwater and eventually take our hands off and allow it to rise.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost amusing. Yesterday was the 4th of July, the American independence, and a nation built on kind of people escaping Europe and persecution or looking for you know new lives, and that was the narrative for a long time about kind of the success of that integration and that country building, and and now the walls are going up, the boundaries are going up, the opposite narrative is countering that, and it's a big paradox.
And this is where it comes back to narrative and the importance of your work and your particular background and your understanding of the human mind, because certainly if we take temporarily a parochial UK perspective, the narratives that we hear, certainly from politicians, but predominantly in the media, are just not really truthful narratives.
No, no.
We're not given an objective assessment of the situation of the challenges of global asylum. We're not contending with the realities of it, and so we're not having a mature conversation around what we can best do to address these changing problems.
No, no, that's right. What in your life, Paul? What is on your mind at the moment?
So I think it's, I suppose, in any circumstance, my role is often to help to illuminate the shadow.
Hmm.
And I think that we very easily in today's world, so there's a lot of reason for us to be pulled apart.
Yeah.
Okay, so politically, largely fueled by social media, views are becoming more separated, and we can think of the problems in Paris at the moment, for example. It's
Hmm.
tending to be separated. The problem, a lot of the difficulties in the US recently have been because it's easier for people to be at the extreme ends of their own parties rather than to find something. Economically, we're seeing ever rising disparities. In technology, there's a real risk that AI could further accelerate and be a force multiplier of some of the threats and some of the aspects of capitalism that take us further apart from each other, rather than bringing us together. And so I think the challenge is often, what is it in the shadows? The climate emergency, of course, accrued large, the most tangible impacts of the climate emergency were at the poles initially,
Hmm.
out of sight, out of mind. The most tangible dimensions of inequality tend to be between in groups and out groups rather than within in groups, where we would perhaps see them and respond empathically and see opportunities to correct that problem more quickly. If we think of AI, then that's the potential threat of unintended consequence, which is very much almost a definition of emerging from the shadows. There's a wonderful line in a 16th century Spanish poem by Luis de Góngora: Nocturno el lobo en las sombras nace, cébase. It's the wolf that leaps from the shadows.
Yes.
And I think part of my role is to help people cultivate a purpose that is more inclusive so they don't get bitten by that wolf.
Yes, well, that's a good purpose to have. It's a very good purpose to have. Have you any questions? You said at the beginning that you thought this might be a therapy session. Have you got any questions to your therapist?
um, So as a quick plug, I'm going to have a lot of questions for you because people can look up my nonprofit community, marketingkind.org, and we have a digital fireside where we're going to be thinking about systemic leadership through the lens of, in your case, ecosystem leadership. And so I'm looking forward to, I think, understanding from you how some of the approaches of, say, it's interesting. So we did an event earlier in the year with John Elkington, who developed the triple bottom line concept, grandfather of the sustainability movement. And one of his notions is that at one point earlier in the career, he conceived of himself as a corporate psychiatrist. And I think something I'm curious to learn from you is how we can put in some of the scaffolding of that perspective around some of the leadership challenges of today, and how we might use some of the frameworks and the understanding of how we mentally map the world, and how we can use that understanding to elevate the vision that we can perceive and achieve. So that might be rather an ambitious question. But
Yeah, well, we can definitely discuss that on the fireside. I mean, but just to say for now that my kind of life experience drawing on psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and working clinically with many people suffering and going through deep emotional kind of trauma, bringing that to organizations is very relevant, I think, and I think it is a kind of a missing link quite often, that why things get repressed, why people often they really want to change, they really they really have a goodwill and they want to change, and yet they stop themselves and they don't understand why they get into patterns individually, collectively, in organizations. They agree, they have the will to change, and yet there's something which is self-sabotaging within that. And that's one of the lenses I work with quite a lot, really, to try and understand, why that happens.
yeah, there's something so interesting in the notion of trauma, I think, as an outsider to the field, which is that there's clearly a link between sort of mental health, how we represent the world, how we map our way through life. What's so fascinating about trauma is it roots that understanding in the environment and what has happened to us. And
Yeah.
so, for example, in organizational life at the moment, we are in a crisis-prone macro environment. There's more setbacks, there's more complexity, there's more uncertainty, there's more opportunities for disappointment because a particular outcome may no longer be possible. There's more being subject to the impact of what economists call exogenous variables, or what I call the things that take us by surprise. And so, in a sense, I think we need to develop a whole new organizational psychosocial dynamics that maybe has learned something from your world, that has learned something from the world of disasters and emergencies, and that gives us a different map to use when the environment in which we're operating, is affected by, has tremendous opportunities on the upside, tremendous opportunities. So I don't want to take away from the optimism in life. There's more opportunity today than at any point in human history. But at the same time, there are real challenges and they impinge on us. And so how do we have the right mental models to navigate those kind of challenges is incredibly important today.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you mentioned, not to forget the hopeful side. The psychotherapy world often stays in the shadows side. It kind of it pathologizes the world a little too much. So in my coaching work, we talk about working with the wounded self and the celebrated self, bridging these two. Because for me, the unconscious is not only about hidden repressions and dark forces. It's also about desire. It's also about love. It's also about passion. We have unconscious dynamics, which hidden desires and desires intention with challenges we face and wounded parts of ourselves. So for me, it's always working the two together, and that's very relevant to organizations because organizations are filled with desires as they are with traumas.
Yeah, that's such an interesting framing. And one thing I want to bring out as well is that often, what I refer to as the shadow is really the shadow that is outside of the spotlight. So at
Mm-hmm.
any point in time, we're pursuing a purpose, and that purpose is it's a valuable conscious lens that directs our perceptions. But if the world is changing, and we don't cater for peripheral vision, then
Yeah,
what was
yeah.
previously a valuable lens can become a dangerous set of blinkers. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there was anything wrong with the original purpose. It means that we need to update it. So, if in the individual mind, of course, you've got the top-down executive functioning of I'm here to record a conversation with my friend Simon. But you've also got the bottom-up sensory processing. And if smoke was coming under the door right now, I would hopefully have the presence of mind to say, small favor, but could we continue the recording,
Yeah.
when I've managed to escape from this seemingly burning building? And so, in a sense, I think that, a lot of the shadow is not necessarily, there's another type of shadow that isn't even necessarily the wounded self. It's the self that has become a puppet of yesterday's expectations, the self that is prisoner of the psychological effects of yesterday's sunk costs, that
Sure.
is caught up in the plan continuation bias of the stories that we have inherited, or that is locked in the progress trap that gave us today's success, but is not the right thing if we want to adapt and create tomorrow's success. And
Yeah.
it's sort of shining a light on the things that our prior spotlight, left unilluminated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's very helpful. Paul, we're coming to an end, and I ask guests at the end to think about two things and offer any thoughts they have on what it means to live a good life and what it means to create a good society. So, just through your life's experience, just any arbitrary thoughts which come to your mind on what it means to live a good life and to create a good society.
Probably have 26 thoughts, not two on that. So you can shut me up. But so, first of all, a good life is a narrative, not a thing.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, behavioral terms, we've learned that, logically, if you're asked, you'd say, I'd rather have a good life than a good life story. But what we know from behavioral science is that we gravitate towards the good life story rather than the good life. I mean, the research, for anyone who wants to look it up, for example, you have notions of peak end effect. We typically think somebody had a much happier life if things came good for them at the end. Whereas,
Yes.
of course, in some ways, this doesn't change the average. There's also something called duration neglect. So people would typically assess better a life that has 50 years that are very happy than a life that has 50 years that are very happy and 5 years that are just happy. Whereas, of course,
Mm-hmm.
in reality, you're just subtracting 5 happy years. So that's not better. So we tend to gravitate to good life stories. And the reason for that, I believe in evolutionary terms, is that a good life story is a problem-solving device. When we have a good life story, I can meet you, I can have something to say, I can have something to ask, we have something we can do together. A good life story is such a part of who we gravitate towards, how we build relationships. It's a problem-solving device. We take our most important decisions in life on the basis of narrative, not spreadsheets.
Yeah.
The stories Even in the case of a disaster or an emergency, the narratives that guide how we anticipate, prepare for, and respond to that disaster or emergency have a bigger cumulative practical effect than the unavoidable consequences of the disaster in the first place. So a good life is a narrative. And then in terms of society, just like any narrative, in an ever-changing world, there isn't a fixed end point. There isn't a happily ever after. Our stories are much more, they're not the story told by an adult to a child and, happily ever after. It's more the story that, in my experience, children tell adults, which is, and I woke up and it was all a dream. You then move into the next chapter, the next story. And so what I think we need to get better at is reimagining what a good society looks like. And I'll end with one anecdote, if I have permission, which is after Napoleon's invasion, the Prussian government in exile asked aristocrats to send in their gold and silver jewelry to fund an uprising against Napoleon, which became the War of Liberation. But their masterstroke was to send back replicas of that jewelry made of iron, which became known as Berlin iron, with patriotic slogans engraved in the back. So that overnight, aristocrats could no longer impress each other and everyone else and lord over each other with the impressive gold and silver jewelry they had. That would have been a disgrace. On the other hand, showing off their patriotic Berlin iron suddenly was a guarantee of social success. And I think we need to learn a little bit from, the Prussian government in exile. And what we need to do today is to help each other to reimagine new versions of success, jettisoning outmoded visions of success when they no longer serve us, and harnessing that energy to embrace a new vision. And I think this is possible. We had a conversation at Marketing Kind with Ian Golden, who was vice president of the World Bank. Before that, he was Nelson Mandela's chief economic advisor. And he believes we can change these kinds of stories much quicker than we realize. He had the direct experience that, while nobody would think apartheid was a good idea for South Africa today, a majority of white people did at the time that Mandela was in prison. As a rule of thumb, 20% of us can change 80% of our stories. And it's those stories that determine what kind of outcomes we achieve. And so my hope is that, people like me, people like you, people like the groups that we work with, one thing we have in common is hopefully we can come together to raise our collective narrative competence, such that we can lead the versions of a good life and create the versions of a good society that are adapted to the particularities of this phase of human development that we're now living through.
Paul Skinner, thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting. I look forward to continuing in other places. Go well.